It is a wicked cozy day. It's snowing outside and I am in the mood for a recipe and a story. So this cookie recipe is so fragrant, aromatic. I mean, really makes you feel cozy and at home in any space. And it is a molasses recipe. That's nice. We've got some B vitamins and some potassium and all that. But it always reminds me of a story so fantastic that you would swear it was fiction. But as they say, truth is stranger than fiction. This story takes place on January the 15th, 1919 in the North End of Boston. So the North End of Boston, let me set the scene. Okay, beautiful old world charm, Italian restaurants and colonial history and bakeries. But January the 15th, 1919, a giant tsunami of molasses was released into the North End of Boston. You can imagine that this was quite the debacle. Now, how did something so messed up happen, right? Well, I have one word for you, and it's humans. And then I have another word for you, and that's negligence. And put it together, human negligence, always a disaster. All right, so you know those water towers, they're like up in the air and they're metal. Insert picture here. Now imagine one of those being used to store molasses. Now, what could go wrong? Well, it went terribly wrong. So it started, the metal tower thing started to leak molasses. Molasses is brown, of course. So like the solution from these molasses hoarding people, I don't know, some molasses company, they decided to just paint the tank brown to match the leaking molasses. Never mind this thing was leaking, and then they kept pumping it full of more and more molasses. The tank held 2.3 million gallons of molasses. Typical Boston weather the day before the disaster had been freezing. The next day, January 15th, got up to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Due to thermal expansion and the fact that this tank was already a leaky hot mess, it exploded at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The ground shook. People thought they heard machine guns going off, but it was just the rivets shooting out of the tank. Now keep in mind, this molasses had some velocity behind it. So molasses is 12 pounds per US gallon, way heavier than water. Now all of this culminated in a 25-foot high tsunami of molasses going 35 miles per hour right through the heart of the North End. Buildings were swept off their foundations for blocks. People were waist deep in molasses, and unfortunately, there were fatalities. Hundreds of people were injured and 21 people were killed, many horses, because in 1919, they were still having horse-drawn carriages. Many horses died and dogs. Very sad. The tsunami was so strong, it threw a truck. It picked up a truck and threw it into Boston Harbor. I'm going to read to you an eyewitness account from a man named Anthony DeStasio. So it says, while walking homeward with his sisters from the Michelangelo School, he was picked up by the wave and carried, tumbling on its crest, almost as though he was surfing. Then he grounded, and the molasses rolled him like a pebble as the wave diminished. He heard his mother call his name, and he couldn't answer. His throat was so clogged with the smothering goo. Ooh, he heard his mother call his name again. He passed out, then opened his eyes to find 3 of his horse sisters staring at him. I would stare too. So the aftermath of this was quite intense, and I will insert some pictures here. For years after, it was reported that everything a Bostonian touched was sticky. And I can personally attest to the fact that on a very hot and humid day in the North End, you can still smell molasses, and I'm not even kidding. Also, to this day, on certain buildings in the North End, you can see the stain, the line where the molasses reached up towards. And it's about maybe 8 feet high on these buildings, and you can see that line, that stain. All right, now who is in the mood for molasses cookies? Start with 2 cups of flour, then 1 teaspoon of baking soda and 1 teaspoon of baking powder, ½ teaspoon of salt, 1.5 teaspoons of ginger, ½ teaspoon of ground cloves, a teaspoon of ground cinnamon, ½ teaspoon of nutmeg, ½ teaspoon of ground cardamom. Mix them all together. ½ cup of molasses, 8 tablespoons of softened butter. Once the mixture is crumbly, add a tablespoon of water. Refrigerate 15 minutes. Form into balls and roll in sugar. Bake at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes. Enjoy with a cup of ginger tea.